This is the voice of Idaho agriculture. Each week, we bring you agriculture news and perspective. Stay tuned to this week's Idaho Farm Bureau's weekly podcast from the state capitol. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jake Putnam. Congress will likely consider another continuing resolution this month to fund federal farm programs. Michael Clements has more.
Congress has few days left to complete the 2020 appropriations process before a continuing resolution expires. R.J. Carney, American Farm Bureau Federation Congressional Relations Director, says the House and Senate are still working on spending levels for agriculture.
The good news right now is both the House and Senate have passed, in both chambers, fiscal year 20 agricultural spending bill. In the House, the total allocation was $24.3 billion in discretionary funding. And in the Senate, it was a total allocation of $23.1 billion in discretionary funding.
Carney says the differences in the bills include relocation funds for USDA agencies and stress assistance for farmers.
In the House, there is a prohibition on USDA's relocation of ERS to Kansas City, while in the Senate, there is no prohibition. Additionally, there's a Farmer Stress Assistance Network. In the House, allocates $10 million, while in the Senate, there is a $3 million allocation.
A continuing resolution currently funding the government expires November 21. Carney expects lawmakers will need to pass another continuing resolution.
All indications are that there will be another continuing resolution to keep the government open past November 21st. The House and Senate leadership are currently discussing how long this next continuing resolution should be. It could be as early as December of 2019. There's also talk of pushing it till February of 2020, and even some rumblings of just doing a full year-long continuing resolution that will go till September 30th of 2020.
Michael Clements, Washington.
With a much-delayed harvest for many crops and with uncooperative harvest weather, how certain can we be of the USDA's latest crop production estimates? Gary Crawford has more.
Well, the markets have digested last week's round of crop reports, which took corn yield and production down a little bit, wheat down quite a bit on harvested acreage reductions, and made very little change to the soybean outlook. The question is, though, with harvesting, especially corn, being so far behind, what is the confidence level in the results of last week's reports? We got opinions from two USDA officials. First, acting USDA Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski.
It is certainly a fact that the harvest is delayed, almost historically delayed. And the weather starts to turn bad, so it's reasonable to expect that where we are at this point in time in the calendar, that there is probably more uncertainty than usual.
And USDA Deputy Chief Economist Warren Preston put a finer point on that.
The expectation is, if anything, that these crops could become smaller as opposed to getting larger.
Problem is, USDA doesn't usually update its estimates of corn and soybean crops until January, so the uncertainty will continue. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And the USDA is reporting some remarkable progress in harvesting sugar beets.
As recently as last Friday, analysts were worried that given the awful weather in the north where sugar beets are grown, that a significant part of that crop would not be harvested at all. But this week's crop progress report shows tremendous progress in sugar beet harvesting. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey told us.
As fields began to freeze up due to the extremely cold weather, producers went in and were able to harvest almost all of the remaining sugar beets, particularly in the Red River Valley of the north. Overall sugar beet harvest advancing fairly rapidly from 70 to 96% complete during the week ending November 10th.
And Rippey says producers in North Dakota have brought in 99% of the beet crop, and Minnesota farmers have completed their harvest. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And a visit to Mexico last week gave the U.S. Ag Secretary a chance to talk about the guest worker program with Mexican officials. Rod Bain has more.
That was one of the primary issues we wanted to talk about was the labor issue.
Which Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue did with government counterparts during his recent visit to Mexico, including
encouraging Mexico to do what we feel like other triangle countries are doing and help to pre-certify, particularly those farmers and people in southeastern Mexico who would like to come to the U.S. for economic opportunities and a reliable ag labor workforce there to work with us in that way. They seem very interested in that.
The Secretary adds both countries appear to agree on a modernized centralized H-2A program that would not only allow for a trained labor pool for U.S. producers and economic opportunity for migrant laborers.
We've had some issues this year over where recruiters have been called into having people pay, and there have been some difficulties with the State Department over some recruiters that may not have been playing by the rules. This would eliminate that.
A concept Secretary Perdue says Mexican officials like and would participate in via pre-certification processes. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's it for this week's podcast. You can drop us a line on Twitter or on Facebook and tell us what you thought of this week's program. For Steve Ritter, this is Jake Putnam and the voice of Idaho Agriculture.